Welcome to 'Tis the Soundtrack, the channel dedicated to digging deep and bringing you the merriest of music all year long. I'm your host, Kevin Williams, and today we're exploring Disney holiday loops and the holiday music of Buena Vista Street in Disney California Adventure. Let me start by saying there are only two things in this world that rival my love of Christmas. Disney is one of them, coffee is the other. In fact, if you zoomed in on the epicenter of my personal Venn diagram of happiness, you would find me stepping out of the market house, coffee in hand, and waiting for rope drop while taking in the sights, sounds, and smells of Disneyland at Christmas time. Oh, and let's not forget my family. I guess that makes three things that rival my love of Christmas. And yes, they would be present in this fantasy, though they look a little disgruntled. See, here, we're already on day 5 of our hypothetical vacation, and we've been closing down the parks each night. Everyone's feet are a little sore, and everyone's operating on a little less sleep than they'd prefer. And while I'm breathing in the early morning Disney magic, they're all remembering back to that time I did the episode on holiday loops and almost forgot to acknowledge the copious amounts of happiness they bring me. It seems like they still haven't let that one go. I suppose you might be asking why I didn't simply go back and edit the first sentence of this script, correct my omission, and ensure my love for my family was never called into question. Well, instead I wrote and recorded the 3 additional paragraphs of nonsense you're listening to right now. It's all a desperate attempt to ensure the episode length is over 10 minutes. And I apologize. So what does any of this have to do with Disney holiday loops or Buena Vista Street? Well, nothing really. This was going to be the introduction to my inaugural episode about the Disney Christmas Favorites album, but I just wasn't able to shoehorn it in. So I tucked it away for the next time the topic of Disney was discussed. If you're hearing this, it looks like this is the episode where it made it through editing and into the final cut.
You did it! Congratulations!
For those of you who have never set foot in a Disney park, music is a big part of the experience. Not just on the rides, or attractions as Disney calls them, but each area of the park, each hotel and shopping district has its own unique soundtrack, usually around an hour in length and played continuously, hence the loop, to further add to the immersion. For example, walking down the Esplanade, you're greeted with classic Disney movie tunes like You've Got a Friend in Me, Be Our Guest, or the Star Wars theme. Well, normally, except they switched up the playlist last year as part of the Disney 100 celebration and leaned hard into the music of past and present attractions. But, regardless of the version you hear, this particular loop executes its mission flawlessly. It's a pure hit of nostalgia that both pumps you up for the day you're about to have in the park and acts as that last bit of pixie dust to send you off into the evening. Let me take a small detour here to explain the Esplanade to anyone unfamiliar with the term, especially Walt Disney World fans who are often flummoxed by the concept. At the Disneyland Resort in California, the original resort, the greatest resort, the only Disney resort that Walt Disney himself ever stepped foot inside, there are 2 gates, Disneyland and Disney California Adventure. The entrances to these 2 parks stand directly across from each other, about 200 feet away. The area in between, which also connects the gates to the downtown Disney shopping district, the shuttle bus area, and the pedestrian walkway from Harbor Boulevard, is the Esplanade. As I mentioned, this is an especially hard concept for Walt Disney World fans to understand, where they have to take a combination of buses, monorails, boats, and gondolas through miles of humid, alligator-infested swampland to get from one gate to another. Out here on the Best Coast, it's a 30-second walk down a breezeway.
We are number 1. Hey!
Okay, now that we have that out of the way, on to Buena Vista Street, by way of another slightly winding narrative. As I mentioned before I derailed this episode with my lighthearted Walt Disney World bashing, musical loops play all throughout the Disney parks and properties. During the holiday season, a vast majority of these convert over to Christmas loops, each unique and with songs selected to match the theme and ambiance of their area. My first and last time experiencing Disneyland at Christmas time was our family vacation in December 2019. Now, I've always loved Christmas, and by extension Christmas music. It would be kind of hard to imagine someone devoting this kind of time and effort to the topic if they didn't. But experiencing Disneyland at Christmas time elevated it from love to obsession. Even today, hearing the intro to David Rose's The Christmas Tree causes me to take a deep breath and look up, just like I did the first time I heard it on Main Street, USA, staring up at the exaggerated holiday garlands and trying to work out in my head how I could replicate them at my own home. And then COVID happened. By June 2020, I was working from home, wondering when lockdown would end, wondering why Spotify was relentlessly suggesting The Cure's Disintegration album, and just as importantly, wondering when the happiest place on earth would reopen. My tank of Disney magic, which had been overflowing just 6 months earlier, was completely drained. I needed something, some way to get my Disney fix. That's when I stumbled upon the Magical Soundtracks channel on YouTube, which contained nearly all of the Disneyland area loops and many of the holiday versions. Not to mention many of the Walt Disney World loops for any of you folks who haven't already left in a rage. These loops became my go-to work-from-home background music for the rest of 2020. And each year since then, when Thanksgiving rolls around, the holiday versions receive a good amount of airplay in my home. Some have even found their way into my yearly traditions. For example, the day after Thanksgiving is when my outdoor decorations go up, and for the last 4 years, the Disney Springs holiday loop has been my decorating soundtrack. But that's a topic for another episode. Today we're talking about the Buena Vista Street holiday loop. Finally. Buena Vista Street is the first area you step into once you are through the gates at Disney California Adventure. When the park originally opened in 2001, it was called Sunshine Plaza and was themed to look like a postcard of California, complete with a Golden Gate Bridge that the Disneyland monorail passed over. In the late 2000s, much of California Adventure underwent a major renovation and retheming. In mid-2012, Sunshine Plaza was reopened as Buena Vista Street, transformed from a modern stylized version of California to a less modern but still highly stylized version of Los Angeles circa 1920s to 1930s, complete with a replica of the Carthay Circle Theater where Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs premiered in 1937. This rehab included an overhaul to the area music loop as well. It went from a California-themed playlist that leaned heavily on the 1960s to a period-appropriate soundtrack of big band, jazz, and swing tunes. The holiday loop was also refreshed. Gone was the surf-heavy soundtrack featuring Christmas tunes from the Beach Boys, the Ventures, and the Wavebenders. In its place is a selection of jazz and swing holiday tunes from folks like Benny Goodman, Woody Herman, Ralph Marterie, and Fats Waller.
Don't you swing them jingles, son.
The Buena Vista Street holiday loop consists of Winter Weather by Benny Goodman and Peggy Lee, Let It Snow, Let It Snow, Let It Snow by Woody Herman and his orchestra, I've Got My Love to Keep Me Warm by Red Norvo and his orchestra featuring Mildred Bailey, Swingin' Them Jingle Bells by Fats Waller, Dig That Crazy Santa Claus by Ralph Marterie and his orchestra, Meet Me Under the Mistletoe by Dick Robertson and his orchestra, Santa Claus Came in the Spring by Benny Goodman and Joe Harris, Santa Claus is Coming to Town by Woody Herman and his orchestra, Winter Wonderland by Lou Stone and his orchestra, It's Beginning to Look a Lot Like Christmas by Bing Crosby, a second version of Santa Claus is Coming to Town by Tommy Dorsey and his orchestra, I Told Santa Claus to Bring Me You by Walter Cummins and Bernie Cummins, a second version of Winter Wonderland by Parker Gibbs and Ted Weems, Frosty the Snowman by Jan Garber and his orchestra, a second rendition of Jingle Bells, this time the classic by Bing Crosby and the Andrews Sisters, a second version of Let It Snow, Let It Snow, Let It Snow, this time by Les Brown and his band of renown, a second version of Jingle Bells by Mora's Modern Rhythmists, and a third version of Santa Claus is Coming to Town by Bing Crosby and the Andrews Sisters, and finally, What Will Santa Claus Say by Louis Prima.
Now what will Santa Claus say when he finds everybody swinging? What will Santa Claus say when he hears us sing, sing, singing?
That's a lot of orchestras, and that's not a bad thing. The Buena Vista Street holiday loop is one of my favorites from any of the Disney parks, and, song repetition aside, it's a great hour of swingin' Christmas music. When the holidays come around, I'll often put this loop on in the kitchen on a weekend morning while I'm making breakfast. It's an upbeat contrast to a typically dark, cold winter morning. Though my brain has now formed a strong correlation between Louis Prima and the smell of Dutch babies cooking, so it's not without its side effects. The Buena Vista Street holiday loop also contains some fantastic Christmas gems that you might not hear regularly during the holiday season. Fats Waller's Swingin' Them Jingle Bells, Benny Goodman's Santa Claus Came in the Spring, and What Will Santa Claus Say by the previously mentioned Louis Prima all fall into this category for me. As does Meet Me Under the Mistletoe, which has a special connection. I have a wonderful memory of sitting with my family on the benches that surround the Christmas tree on Buena Vista Street, looking at all the period-inspired ornaments like the Santa faces and bells featuring Disney characters while this song played in the background. Two fun Disney facts about the Buena Vista Street tree. First, the bell ornaments on the Buena Vista Street tree were designed by artist Sam Carter. He took inspiration from real Disney-licensed bell Christmas lights from the 1930s. Next, all of the ornaments on the Buena Vista Street tree are made in multiple sizes, with the ornaments getting smaller the farther up the tree they are hung. This adds to the forced perspective and makes the tree, which is already quite large, appear even taller. Now back to the music, and again I apologize for all the tangents today. Out of all the songs on the Buena Vista Street holiday loop, it's the 3 Bing tracks that feel the most out of place, which is a very odd thing to say. They stand out for their vocal forward pop sound that didn't really become popular until the following decade. In fact, Bing didn't record his versions of Jingle Bells and Santa Claus is Coming to Town until the 1940s, 43 and 47 respectively. It's Beginning to Look a Lot Like Christmas wasn't recorded until 1951, the same year Meredith Willson wrote the song. It pains me to say it, but I think the loop would be a tighter, more cohesive representation of the 20s and 30s sound if you just plucked out the 3 Bing tracks and left the rest. And, since all of Bing's contributions are duplicate tracks anyway, one being a triplicate, I don't think you'd lose much with the edit. There, I've said it. Which brings me to my hopefully final tangent of the episode. From time to time, I'll see Disney bloggers or hear YouTubers state that Buena Vista Street has a much more rigid timeline. Rather than existing in an amorphic period somewhere in the 20s to 30s, it's supposed to represent LA in 1923, the year Walt arrived. This is often followed by call-outs or complaints of items that exist on Buena Vista Street, but did not exist in Los Angeles in 1923 on Earth 1218. That last bit is for the Marvel nerds out there. This airing of grievances extends to both the regular area music and the holiday loop. I did some research to try and find out if Disney ever assigned a specific date to Buena Vista Street, like they have with other areas and attractions. For example, the Disneyland version of the Jungle Cruise is explicitly set in June 1938. I found a series of posts Disney released on their blog in the run-up to Buena Vista Street opening in June 2012. A post from the beginning of April started with, "When you enter Disney California Adventure Park this summer, you'll step back in time to Los Angeles of the 1920s and 30s on Buena Vista Street." Seems settled, right? And it was, for exactly 2 weeks. Then another blog post was released which said, "This busy California street will take you back to 1923, when Walt Disney first arrived in California." Personally, I adhere to the looser interpretation, with the area being an amalgamation of 1920s to 30s Los Angeles, and the things that inspire or evoke that period of time, though not strictly adhering to it themselves. Looking at the non-holiday loop, it contains recordings all the way through the early 2000s, but they are all tracks that faithfully reproduce that early swing and jazz sound that would be at home in the era Buena Vista Street is portraying. The holiday version is a much tighter grouping, sourced mostly from the mid-20s to early 50s. But this again makes me question the inclusion of Bing. Chronologically, they were close to the eras being represented, but a shift musically from the rest of the soundtrack. Heck, since we're not specifically limiting ourselves to 20s and 30s recordings, there's a whole catalog of Ella Fitzgerald Christmas tunes that could have been used instead. In fact, she has versions of both Jingle Bells and Santa Claus is Coming to Town on her 1960 album, Ella Wishes You a Swingin' Christmas, that, at least to me, seem a way better fit on Buena Vista Street, despite being recorded another decade later.
Dashing through the snow in a one-horse open sleigh, o'er the fields we go, laughing all the way.
Coincidentally, some of Ella's tracks from this album are used in the Q loop for the Jungle Cruise's holiday overlay, the Jingle Cruise, which we've established is set in June 1938, yet seems right at home. But that's another Q loop for another day. And look at that, we've shot way past our 10-minute goal. I've added a link in the show notes to the Magical Soundtracks YouTube channel, and a link to a title playlist I've created containing the Buena Vista Street holiday loop songs. Thank you for listening to 'Tis the Soundtrack. This is Kevin Williams, saying cheers and Merry Christmas.